Hi, and welcome to Session 7's Reading Comprehension segment. Today we're going to look at arguments, and we're going to move quickly through basically one example of all the possible question types you could be faced with. It's very important that you have already read Chapter 9 in the Reading Comprehension book and are well versed in the elements of arguments before you begin watching today's session. So if you haven't read that chapter yet, go ahead and pause or stop the recording. Go read the chapter, and then when you're ready, play this recording again. Just a quick reminder, this information is included in the chapter, but just for today's discussion, a few small words can be really important on all reading comprehension passages as we've seen, especially the arguments ones, because they can help us put the passage in logical order, which is really the task ahead of us. So first of all, we want to remember that there are classes of words: premises, evidence on which argument is built. And these premises have common keywords that indicate them. Because and since are probably the most common, but anytime there's a study or an evidence or any kind of fact whatsoever presented, this is a premise. You cannot argue with the premise. Premise must be accepted as fact and used in the argument. Logic, which is what you're being asked to evaluate here in these questions, is about connecting a fact to a claim. It's not about the fact in isolation, and it's not about the claim in isolation either. It's about the movement from the premise to the conclusion, and conclusions have easily identifiable keywords the vast majority of the time. Thus, therefore, hence, so. Should is a very important one to put on that list as well, because anytime the author is making an evaluation or a prescription of some kind, you should vote for candidate XYZ. This is a conclusion, a persuasive claim, judgment, evaluation, etc. There's another class of words within these arguments that's very important, and you've already been examining them in your approach to text completions and sentence equivalence problems, and these are the pivots. Pivots often lead us away from someone else's point of view, a counter argument or a counter perspective, into the author's conclusion. So watch out for buts and howevers and on the contraries, now versus then, modern versus historical, etc., etc. So let's look at some of these question types, and let's remember that in general, these passages are one paragraph and you get one question per paragraph. You're going to see anywhere from 1 to 3 of these per section, which means anywhere from 2 to 6 of these on the day of your test. And it's not really about reading comprehension in the same way that the long and short passages we've looked at in previous sessions. These are logic questions, so it's very important that you're looking at putting things in the order that they go in. Our approach is to diagram this, and you should know how to do this from reading the strategy guide. That we're going to try to make sense of where the author begins, with what facts or evidence the author cites, and then where the author moves to whatever conclusion they're trying to draw. Anticipating the answer will be a very important part of our process. It's much like text completions, where you want to avoid looking at the answer choices. Avoid rushing unprepared into the choices, hoping that the choices will help you figure out what's important, or that the choices will help you decide what to do. And work on anticipating the answer to the question before you reveal the choices, and then follow through with a very diligent process of elimination, using the letters A through E on your scratch paper to help you stay organized. A reminder about how to diagram. First, I'll give you a moment to read this argument. Now, of course, it's very important on the screen that you understand what the question is asking. In fact, I recommend reading the question first. So, which of the following follows most logically from the argument? Follows logically. This is asking me for a sort of conclusion. So what this means, and the reason that it's important to read this first, is that the argument I'm looking at may not actually be an argument. It might be a list of facts, and then my job is to fill in the conclusion that these facts are obviously designed to introduce. So we can anticipate the answer from this point. Now remember that on your paper, you should draw something along the lines of a T-chart that looks like this. You've been taught this in the strategy guide, so this is old news. And then there, list the premises here, and list them in as good of as concise a shorthand as you possibly can. This example on the screen for me is actually quite a few words. It has benefits and side effects. Doctors are responsible for weighing the benefits and the side effects, and most doctors have chosen not. So notice how we have a little note here basically for each sentence. There's typically very little fluff in these arguments. Most of the time, each sentence is going to play a role, and that role revolves around the conclusion. So in this instance, due to the question type that we're looking at, we know that there is no conclusion. Our job is to draw that conclusion, which would normally go on top of our T-chart. So here, we can take a moment to consider the relevant facts and then anticipate what kind of conclusion can we draw based on those three facts. And once you've taken a moment to do that, so let's just think about it one more time explicitly. The drug has benefits and side effects. Doctors are the ones responsible for weighing those benefits and side effects. And most doctors have chosen not to prescribe this particular drug. What conclusion does this lead us to draw? And can we recognize it in the choices? I'll give you 30 seconds. Now that wasn't very long. If you need a little bit of extra time, go ahead and pause the recording and take that time. Let's take a look at answer choice A. Nephroprene will not cure patients. What's interesting about this choice is that it kind of seems like that's true. I mean, the doctors aren't even going to prescribe it to the patients who would experience benefits. But while this is probably true, this is not the conclusion of the argument. The conclusion of the argument must be something about the doctors here. They're responsible for weighing the benefits and side effects. They don't prescribe it. What does that mean? Well, that means that they must have considered it, and they must think that the drawbacks outweigh the benefits. Otherwise, why wouldn't they prescribe it to those who would experience benefits? This, of course, is perfectly matched in answer choice B. With answer choice C, we have no idea whether these people are able to obtain it or not. This might be true, it might not. Either way, this isn't the conclusion of the argument. And the same goes for D. It might be true that not everyone can be helped by it. That's true of most drugs. However, that's not the conclusion of this argument. And with answer choice E, first of all, this kind of answer is extremely unlikely to be correct in the first place because it's kind of insulting. These guys aren't doing their jobs. And the GRE typically doesn't like to insult people. So as a general rule, this kind of answer is extremely unlikely to be correct. And here, the notion of fulfilling or not fulfilling duties as doctors is far beyond the scope of the argument we've been presented with. Our next flavor we want to examine today is resolve a paradox. So what I'd like to do is, without giving you the choices, I'll just give you a minute to read and diagram the argument. It's helpful to know that a paradox and a contradiction are basically used synonymously on the GRE. The point being, in a resolve a paradox question, there must be two seemingly contradictory facts. we must have two facts that seem to go against one another. He was tall and yet he was short. Okay, these two contradictory ideas. Our job is to isolate the two facts that seem to contradict one another, and then when we get to the choices, we'll choose an answer that allows both of them to be true, that explains why, despite the fact that they seem to go against one another, they coexist. Okay, I'll give you a minute to diagram. Now, you might have noticed that in resolve a paradox arguments, there is probably not going to be a conclusion in the argument. And that's not even really going to be your focus anyway. So it's another good reason to preview the question before you analyze the passage or the argument. Because here, it's not really an argument. It's just a display of facts. You have to isolate the ones that contradict. So the notes on your scratch paper might look something like this. You could go ahead and draw your T-chart just so that you have a consistent diagramming method for all the questions, but you won't have anything above because there's no conclusion here. This is also a very numbers-heavy, sort of math-heavy argument, so take the time up front to get organized with your understanding before you get lost in the jungle of the choices. So what we know is that in 2008, there were 350,000 in poverty. Then, and there's all these increases, there's average, there's distribution, there's some decreases. It's very important, again, just to stay organized and do whatever you need to take some shorthand notes to understand the relationship of these things and isolate that contradiction before you go to the choices. So, we have a certain number in poverty, population goes down, average income goes up, and income distribution remains the same. Finally, a sharp increase in poverty. Now notice all the question marks and exclamation points off this because, or following this, because this is a surprising fact. If the population actually goes down and average income increases, one would expect poverty to decrease. So when average income has increased and poverty has increased, this is the paradox, or this is the contradiction that we're looking for. How could these two possibly coexist? And now when we go to the answer choices, we have a much better idea of what we're looking for. We need a new fact that will explain why poverty went up when all this other evidence suggests that, if anything, poverty should have gone down. So what happens when we get to the choices? I'll give you 30 seconds. Now let's take a look. And hopefully your own rhythms and your own timing are kind of mirroring what we're doing here. More time spent understanding the passage and getting very clear about your task and anticipating the answer, and then less time spent quickly eliminating answers and identifying the best two candidates most often, and then making a choice between the two best candidates. Here, there are some answer choices that stick out as being typically wrong many times over and over again on these arguments questions. With answer choice A, we run into a very common problem here that it doesn't matter what happened in the other years. What happened in earlier years is not going to help us explain why poverty went up in 2009. Answer choice B tries to give us an imaginative explanation. There were natural disasters, and perhaps we immediately think of New Orleans or something. I do anyway. I think of Hurricane Katrina, some recent natural disaster. Perhaps you think of something in another part of the globe. And so in this line of thinking, you think, oh, okay, natural disaster. That sort of explains why there would be an increase in poverty. But this would be too imaginative for this particular exercise. We'd have to make all sorts of assumptions about what the natural disasters would do and what they would cause. And furthermore, this doesn't explain why average income went up. If the natural disasters were causing this increase in poverty that we're thinking about, that still doesn't explain why income went up at the same time. So we need to be careful that we don't choose answers that sort of imaginatively explain one side of the paradox. We need both sides to be able to coexist. With answer choice C, health problems. Who cares about health problems? That has nothing to do with whether there was an increase in poverty or not. Answer choice D, they changed their definition of poverty. This could lead to more people being considered to be in poverty. A sharp increase in poverty if we change the definition to a wider scope. Now, it doesn't say that it did it to a wider scope, but this is likely, and this is something that would make logical sense. So if they change the definition, that would change our understanding of who was in or not in poverty. So at the very least, we need to leave this answer and evaluate answer choice E. With answer choice E, the number dropped back to 2008 levels later. Well, who cares what happened in the future? This will do nothing to explain to me why there was an increase in poverty in 2009. Answer choice D is going to do the most to help us resolve this paradox. All right, I'll give you a minute to work with another very similar problem. Again, try to get in the habit of previewing the question first and then moving to anticipating an answer. Then I'll reveal the choices and we can do a process of elimination. For now, 1 minute to diagram and understand. So again, isolate the two facts that seem to contradict, and it's easier to anticipate an answer. Very difficult to predict an answer. So that's an important shift in vocabulary. We're not recommending that you try to predict exactly what the choice will say. We're asking that you anticipate what kind of role the answer should play. So it's very difficult to predict the way the GRE will phrase things word for word, but we can get in the ballpark of what function the answer choice needs to perform. So here we've got some numbers again, 55 to 85. We've got the number of women who considered themselves self-employed rose, okay? Very important once they introduce the concept of numbers to track, because sometimes they use numbers, sometimes they use percents, sometimes they use rates. And it's very important to get organized and distinguish between these things, because here we have the number went up, but at a lower rate than the number of women participating in conventional full-time employment. So from this, we might take that, oh, the number went up for both categories, both women who consider themselves self-employed and women in conventional full-time employment. However, there was a larger rate of increase in the women with full-time employment than there was in women who considered themselves self-employed. And if you need to write a few notes to track this, that's not a waste of time. Oftentimes students object when we say, draw a T-chart, write out the premises to the argument, write the conclusion down. All sorts of objections about how long it's going to take arise. And to that I have several responses. One is, it's very important, in fact critical, that you take these kinds of notes as you practice, because the point is to develop a mental habit of evaluating these arguments in a consistent fashion, and writing things down and repeating that process is the secret to developing consistent mental habits. So it well may be that by the time you take the actual GRE, you no longer take the same kinds of notes that you used to take. Perhaps you take fewer notes. Perhaps you really don't take any notes at all because you've gotten so sharp at just analyzing them by looking at them. But the surest way to develop those habits, either way, is to write them down in the beginning, and when you feel that you've mastered it, then start to write less and less and less, so that by the time you take the test in several weeks, you may have dropped the habit altogether. And anytime you feel confused or unsure, or if there's a lot of information being presented, resort to taking notes, because getting organized is always a good investment of time on the test. It's not a waste of time. A waste of time would be attempting to wrestle with these answer choices with insufficient notes, and thus having to read the answer choices over and over again, perhaps even having to return to the argument to read it another time, or 2 more times, or 3 more times. That's a waste of time. Getting clear about things and writing it down on your page is not a waste of time. So, we need a piece of information that will directly contradict what's given above. So this is a slightly different question than the one we were looking at. The question we were looking at already had the contradiction in it. Our job was to resolve it. Here, our job is to create a contradiction. So we need to get very clear on what's being presented. The number for both are rising. One is rising at a greater rate. What would contradict with this information? Let's reveal the choices, and I'll give you guys about 30 seconds to evaluate them. Okay, if you need a little more time, feel free to pause the recording, but don't give yourself too much longer. A few extra seconds here and there is okay, but be mindful that you're not spending 2.5, 3 minutes on these. That's simply too much time. So, with answer choice A, from 55 to 85, the number, now we're already in the right ballpark here, because we know we're talking about numbers and rates of women who considered themselves self-employed. This seems directly applicable to the answer, so pay attention. The number increased from 3 to 6.5 million, while the number of conventional full-time increased from 25 to 46. So we need to think. Here they're giving us actual numbers, which would help to clarify the issue above. Let's see if these go together or if they contradict. What is the rate Here's a little, example of the synthesis of subjects. Oftentimes we find that word problems on the quantitative portion of the test are really like verbal problems. Sort of decoding the language or the English in the word problem is the real difficulty, and the math is a breeze. Sometimes we find the same is true in the verbal section, where we have the entry of sort of math and logic kind of creeping in to what is supposed to be a verbal evaluation. So we don't need to bust out equations and stuff. We can clearly see that for women considering themselves self-employed, an increase of 3 to 6.5 is over a 100% increase. We have more than doubled the amount of women. And in the second instance, full-time employment, we have not yet doubled. So self-employed has more than doubled. Full-time has not doubled. This directly contradicts with the information presented above, because the information presented above said that self-employed increased at a lower rate. This information directly contradicts it. It's definitely our answer. And if we recognize this on a question with this kind of certainty, depending on the time restrictions, you could answer A and move forward with confidence. Or if you had the time, if you were not in time trouble, it's never a bad idea to go ahead and look at the 4 remaining choices to be sure that they are incorrect. With answer choice B, the overall labor force decreasing or increasing has nothing to do with the particular rates of these different categories of women. With answer choice C, more women worked in conventional full-time employment than considered themselves self-employed. Well, big deal. We're talking about the rates of increase. So it doesn't matter whether there's only 5 women or 5 million women in either category. What we are supposed to be comparing here is the rate that they increased. With answer choice D, it was even higher than the number participating in full-time employment in 1985. Again, lots of smoke and mirrors in here regarding the different numbers. What we care about is the rate. With answer choice E, again, the number who considered themselves self-employed was higher than the number participating in full-time employment in 55. Lots of sand in your eyes, as I like to think of it. Smoke and mirrors here, trying to spook us and confuse us regarding the number. But if we're really clear in our analysis and what the statement above is actually saying, the only claim made is that the number increased at a lower rate. So these various comparisons in C, D, and E between the number of these women at certain times has absolutely nothing to do with the claim that's being made. Therefore, A is the only one that's even in the ballpark by indirectly revealing the rate, by not just giving us the number at a certain slice of time, but actually giving us the increases and therefore the ability to calculate the rate. A is the only one that's even relevant. And here, it's not just relevant, it's actually correct. Moving on. Let's try a new question type called argument structure. This is exactly how they will appear on the screen when you take the test. There'll be yellow highlighted sentences, and you'll be asked, what roles do they play? Here's a word to the wise. The roles that sentences can play in an argument are actually very limited. We could roughly group them into 3 categories. Either they are the conclusion, they support the conclusion, or they go against the conclusion. We might add a 4th, very rare category that they sort of do absolutely nothing, that they're just fluff. But I've never actually seen that be involved in the answers on a GRE question. So you could think about it in the 3 main areas: being the conclusion, and then either supporting or countering that conclusion. And all you have to do is find the conclusion and then orient the 2 highlighted statements to that conclusion. I'll give you a minute here to analyze, diagram if you wish, anticipate your answer, and then I'll give you another 30 seconds once we reveal the choices. Well, what'd you think? Are you confident in your analysis? Can you already anticipate what the answer choice might reveal about these two sentences? Let's see how well you did. I'll go ahead and give you 30 seconds to choose an answer. All right, if you need a little extra time, pause the recording and take it. But try to get your time on these down to 90 seconds or less. So, when we analyze the argument before considering the answer choices, we have skydiving cannot properly be considered a form of cardiovascular exercise. You might already pause and think, does this sound more like a fact or a claim? Is this something I could argue with or just a number, something mathematical that I need to accept? Moving forward, to be considered a form of exercise. Oh, so we're going to define exercise here. We're saying skydiving is not exercise. Here's a definition of exercise. Activity must raise the heart rate and keep it elevated for at least 20 minutes. Okay. Now that second sentence definitely just sounds like a fact. Here's the definition of exercise. While skydiving certainly does elevate the heart rate, it only does so for 60 to 70 seconds, followed by 5 to 6 minutes under a parachute. Furthermore, notice that important pivot word. We're going in the same direction of whatever has just happened above. We're continuing in that direction. It is not possible to string multiple dives back to back. So which of these individual sentences is the conclusion? Which one of these requires support from the other sentences? And remember that you have the why test or the therefore test at your disposal for identifying a conclusion. For example, let's just look at the two highlighted sentences. If you weren't sure which one was the conclusion, try saying X, in other words, one sentence, sentence 1, therefore, sentence 2, and then switch the order. Sentence 2, therefore, sentence 1, and identify which of those orders makes more logical sense. So in this example, would it be skydiving cannot be considered exercise, therefore, it elevates a heart rate for 60 to 70 seconds and 5 to 6 minutes under a parachute? Clearly not. It would have to be the other way around. Skydiving elevates a person's heart rate, but only for 60 to 70 seconds. Therefore, it cannot be considered a form of exercise. That would be the logical way to order it. So what we can decipher very quickly then is that the first sentence is the conclusion of the argument. And just by knowing this, we can eliminate several answer choices. And in fact, this is the way I would recommend that you do it. Rather than trying to understand or evaluate each answer choice in its entirety, you can just take half of it. When you know what one sentence's role is, you can eliminate the choices that don't describe that role, and then move on to the second choice to make your final decision. So if we know that the first sentence is the conclusion, that would get rid of answer choice A. And just so you know, the definition of an intermediate conclusion is like a conclusion, it is supported by other evidence. The difference is that then that intermediate conclusion goes on to further support a much larger conclusion in the argument. So even if you weren't sure with A, you might leave it now, if you weren't sure if that was an intermediate conclusion, and you would eliminate it later when you see that the second statement is the conclusion is absolutely incorrect for this choice as well. With answer choice B, states a position the argument opposes. That's the opposite of what we want. It's the conclusion of the argument. With answer choice C, provides support for the conclusion. This is incorrect. It is the conclusion. So just by identifying the conclusion, we're down to two answer choices. Whenever you get stuck in any way whatsoever on these arguments questions, the best place to turn is identifying the conclusion. Use the conclusion as your tiebreaker in any instance where you're unsure. So with answer choice D, the main point of the argument, answer choice E, the conclusion. Great. We've run out of eliminating power for statement 1. We need to turn to statement 2. Statement 2 adds information that supports that conclusion. This clearly leads us to answer choice E. Answer choice D is out because obviously this information does not support a position the author opposes. It directly supports the position the author is advocating, that skydiving is not exercise. Moving on, we're going to look in our final 2 examples here at a very related pair of questions, strengthen and weaken. Strengthen and weaken questions are a little more difficult than some of these other ones because in order to weaken an argument, I can bring in completely new and seemingly unrelated information, and the same goes to strengthen. So what seems to be a wacky answer choice or an unrelated answer choice often just through the sort of flow of logic can actually be very relevant. So as a process for approaching these, it's very important to identify the conclusion, identify the main premise, and then to consider any assumptions that might be required to connect that premise to the conclusion. Because oftentimes, in order to weaken an argument, what we'll do is we'll destroy one of the assumptions. Or to strengthen an argument, what we'll do is support or validate one of the assumptions that we need to connect the fact or the evidence to the claim or conclusion. So I'll give you a minute to diagram this one and analyze it in terms of conclusion and premise. Then we'll reveal the choices. So, what's our conclusion here? Notice the first sentence, ostrich meat is becoming popular in the United States. This is not a claim. This isn't really the kind of thing we could argue with. This is just sort of being submitted as evidence. And then we have this very common, very clear pivot. However, ostriches are endangered. And then we follow with a conclusion. If the popularity of ostrich meat continues to grow, ostriches will inevitably become extinct. And notice the sort of extreme nature of this conclusion. They will inevitably, without a doubt, ostriches are going to become extinct. And our task is to weaken this conclusion. So get very clear about this before you go to the answer choices. It might surprise you how often students actually choose answers that do the opposite of what the question is asking for, simply because it's easy to be taken off task under timed pressure, and answer choices that do the opposite. So for example, here we might run into an answer choice that strengthens the argument are often written in a more appealing way, while the choices that answer the question are written in sort of awkward, difficult to decipher ways. So you can go ahead and anticipate. Ostrich meat's becoming popular. They are endangered. Therefore, if the popularity continues to grow, they will inevitably become extinct. In order to weaken this argument, I'm looking to introduce a new fact that will make it less likely that the ostriches will become extinct. I want a new fact that supports the idea that ostriches will not become extinct, but will in fact continue to live. With that in mind, let's look at the answer choices. I'll give you 30 seconds to evaluate them. All right, hopefully that seemed fast and you were able to eliminate 4 of the choices. Let's take a look at answer choice A here. Ostrich meat is not any healthier than lean beef. Our response to that? Who cares? That doesn't weaken or strengthen the argument. I'm trying to understand whether or not these birds are going to become extinct. I don't care how healthy they are compared to beef. With answer choice B, it's considered a gourmet food. Again, who cares what it's considered? Whether it's considered a breakfast item or a dinner menu or a gourmet or common, I want to know if these birds are going to go extinct or not. With answer choice C, there's concerns about bird flu, and some consumers, in fact, many consumers, are going to avoid ostrich meat. This is a very appealing trap answer to a lot of people. Notice that each of these 3 choices so far, what they have attempted to do is attack the premise. And the premise is that ostrich meat is becoming popular. So each of these answer choices is trying to attack that idea. Wait, it's not very healthy. Wait, some people say it's only used on special occasions. Wait, people are scared of the flu. But none of these has anything to do with the conclusion. And the conclusion is based on an if statement that already takes into account all of the potential objections to ostrich's popularity. It says if the popularity continues to grow, they will become extinct. So answer choice C tries to say its popularity won't grow. Answer choice B tries to say it's not that popular. Answer choice A tries to say its popularity won't grow. It's less popular than beef. But all of these have already been taken into account. If they continue to grow in popularity, they will become extinct. So moving on to answer choice D, increased demand for ostrich meat will lead to increased ostrich farming. Now we're taking this into account. If the popularity continues to grow, great, an increased demand. Then if that happens, we're going to have more ostrich farms and we're actually going to increase the number of ostriches. Notice how this choice directly attacks the conclusion. If I'm trying to say that ostriches will inevitably become extinct, and you say we're actually going to increase the number of ostriches, this is a very clear, direct contradiction of the original argument. That's going to be our answer. Let's take a quick look at answer choice E just to be sure. They are killed more frequently for their feathers than they are for their meat. Who cares how many different reasons they are killed for? The question is, if ostrich meat becomes popular, will they or won't they go extinct? Answer choice D is the only one that's even in the ballpark here, and it's our correct answer. Now, let's turn our attention to weaken questions, sort of twin brother or twin sister, strengthen questions. Oftentimes, curiously enough, students often find that they struggle more with one of these than the other. You may very well find this in your own studies, that you feel more confident with attacking conclusions than you do with supporting conclusions. But just know that the basic logic is the same, and to really focus on process of elimination anytime you're unclear, grab the conclusion as sort of your life raft, your sword of arbitration. If you're down to 2 and you don't know which one is right, grab the conclusion and select the answer choice that most directly weakens or strengthens the conclusion. Just make things simple when you're overwhelmed by the complexity. Anyway, let me give you 1 minute to diagram and evaluate this argument. Anticipate some answer choices. So our conclusion here, very easy to identify the keyword thus. We really only have two sentences here, and that helps make our job a lot easier. So the conclusion, notice again this causal nature. The diet and care given to dogs must have declined. Now, the reason that the author is saying this seems to be suggesting that the diet and care must be causing something bad to happen to the dog. So what's the fact that's submitted? Well, the fact is that veterinarians see more fatal heart murmurs in puppies than in dogs over 15 years old. So this is the only fact we have. More heart murmurs in puppies than heart murmurs in old dogs. And on the basis of this heart murmur fact, the author is concluding that the diet and care given to dogs must have declined. Now, this is a pretty bad argument, and this is something that you'll notice often on the GRE, is that these arguments are very needy in terms of assumptions. They need a lot of assumptions in order to make these arguments work. So sometimes, actually, when we have sort of the largest gap to fill between the premise and the conclusion is when it's the hardest to anticipate what our answer could look like. So what's going to strengthen the argument that the diet and care given to dogs has gone down? Well, we could perhaps have some ideas, some evidence submitted related to what diet and care do for dogs. You know, the diet and care are the primary causes of heart murmurs or something like this. And if you anticipated this, you were sort of in the right track, but you might have been disappointed when you get to the choices and you see how they are phrased. So this is a tough question. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to check out these answer choices and see if what you have anticipated actually appears here. 30 seconds beginning now. Very difficult problem here because none of the answer choices that we would commonly anticipate show up. And the correct answer turns out to be one that most people are completely blindsided by. So let's take a look at these answer choices and see how this might play out. With answer choice A, this is an easy elimination. So at least we have a 25% chance of just wildly guessing the right answer because cats and other pets have nothing to do. The conclusion is only about dogs. The whole argument's about dogs. A is an easy elimination. With answer choice B, it's not the case that they typically die before reaching the age of 15. There's this negative in there, this not. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with diet. It's not a very appealing answer to folks right off the bat. It's hard to find a reason to eliminate it, but most people would simply either say it's not their favorite or would just leave it for later. With answer choice C, some brands of dog foods lack essential nutrients seems to go along with the conclusion about diet and care declining. However, there's nothing to say that there is a decline here. They simply lack these nutrients. Did they in the past? Has there actually been a decline? And how many brands? It only says some brands. So if that brand happens to have 1% of the market share, it would be very difficult for us to say that because that brand lacks essential nutrients, the diet and care given to dogs has declined. Appealing choice on the surface, but once we look a little bit deeper, easy to eliminate. With answer choice D, very appealing answer here. In fact, I think most people choose D on this question because it seems to support this premise. The vets know what they're doing, so that supports the premise. The problem here is that logically, this does nothing for our conclusion. So just because we say, yeah, you're right, the vets do know what they're talking about. They know a heart murmur in a puppy versus a heart murmur in a dog that's 15 years old. So what does this have to do with the diet and care declining? Absolutely nothing. Furthermore, this is kind of a false premise booster, we might say, because we already know, this is the fact, veterinarians see more of this kind than they do of this other kind. More heart murmurs in puppies than heart murmurs in old dogs. That's the fact. We don't need to know that the vets are actually qualified to do this. They're vets. This adds little logical, if anything, to the argument. Now, with answer choice E, over the last 15 years, the rates of ownership have remained constant and illnesses have increased. So dogs are sicker than they used to be. This tries to add additional evidence to the idea that their diet and their care must have declined. But notice how this requires lots of assumptions. What else could have caused these illnesses to increase? Does it have to be the diet and the care? Absolutely not. There could have been a nuclear meltdown and the dogs are dying due to radioactivity or radioactive exposure. There could be a genetic mutation, malaria, who knows? All sorts of things could be causing these dogs' illnesses to increase. It doesn't have to be the diet and the care given to the dogs. In fact, it could be heart murmurs for all we know. So another appealing choice here for many reasons superficially, but ultimately no good. And we'd be left with answer choice B, which kind of puts us in a rock and a hard place because we don't really like answer choice B, though we couldn't really see necessarily why it was wrong. So let's take a look. If it's not the case that the heart murmurs typically die before reaching 15, then it would be strange that there are more puppies than 15-year-olds experiencing heart murmurs. So what's interesting about this choice is it doesn't directly support the idea that diet and care have declined. However, it does support the idea that the observations that the vets are making are abnormal. So what's weird about this one is it doesn't directly support necessarily the idea of diet and care, but it does the most of the 5 choices to support that idea because it basically says, hey, the vets are seeing more puppies with heart murmurs, and this is weird. So there must be some other cause out there. There must be something strange happening. Whether or not this strange thing is diet and care, we don't know. So one thing to get very clear on here is your question task. With strength and questions, your objective is not to prove that the conclusion is right. It's just to further its case along. One helpful idea here, when you see an answer choice that's easy to negate, or an answer choice that has a negation in it, like here we have the word not, is you can just take out that word and consider the opposite. And sometimes that can help you kind of triangulate the answer, so to speak. So let's just play a game here. Remove the not from answer choice B and ask yourself, what if it is the case that dogs born with heart murmurs usually die before they reach the age of 15? Now, if that's true, dogs with heart murmurs usually die before they turn 15, then there's nothing strange about the vet's observations. Yes, this is typically normal. We see puppies with heart murmurs. We don't see any 15-year-olds with heart murmurs because they all die before they turn 15. So if we remove the not from answer choice B, there's nothing strange about the vet's observation, and therefore there's no reason to even search for a cause like the diet and care declining to be causing the health of these puppies to deteriorate because it's perfectly normal. Therefore, if the opposite of our answer choice, the negated version of our answer choice, suggests that the situation is totally fine and doesn't need an explanation, then the answer choice we have, unnegated, must do something to support the conclusion we have, which is this situation is weird. This is atypical. This is strange. Therefore, we need to search for a new cause. We need to search for the agent behind the fact that these puppies are sick. That's what B does to logically reinforce this argument. So very tricky spin. It has nothing to do with diet and care and everything to do with linking the conclusion to the premise. So by saying that here's an observation, a neutral fact, a premise, and by saying this is strange, this is atypical, this is not what we would expect to see, that lends, albeit slight, it does lend some logical strength to the idea that we need to search for a cause for the puppy's sickness. Whether that causes diet and care, we still don't know. We haven't proven that the diet and care have declined. We've simply made it more likely that there is a cause, such as the diet and care, behind the situation with the heart murmurs. Tricky example, but one that on the hardest arguments we'll often see, that you can strengthen an argument by just saying, hey, this is strange. It does need an explanation. So in review, takeaways for approaching all of these kinds of questions, it's very important to understand the argument. Identify the conclusion. That's the number one most important thing if you're working an argument that requires a conclusion. So it's also very important to know the question types cold and to know what they require. Resolve the paradox, identify the contradiction, draw a conclusion. Those three don't require that we identify a conclusion because in all likelihood, there's a 99% chance that those arguments have no conclusion. Whereas strengthen or weaken, we need to identify the conclusion before we can move forward. Process the argument before you get to the choices. This is the number one habit that you can develop. The biggest mistake that students make on these problems is getting into the answer choices, thinking that the choices will help them understand the argument, when this is far from the case. Oftentimes, getting into the answer choices before we're really prepared simply confuses us even more or makes a clearly wrong answer seem very tempting. And in your homework, really push yourself to work to identify the conclusions when required. This is sort of the fundamental skill that lies beneath these arguments questions. And when you're reviewing your work, try to dig deeper than just, did I get this one right or did I get this one wrong? Ask yourself questions like, did you correctly identify the conclusion? Because if you didn't, then that's where you got the problem wrong. It doesn't matter what the choices are. If you have misidentified the conclusion, you are likely to get the problem wrong. So start with fundamentals. Did you nail the conclusion? Great, yes. Next question, did you eliminate the correct answer or did you just get down to 2 and not choose it? Because if you eliminated the correct answer, there's more correcting to do than if you simply got down to 2, weren't sure, and didn't choose it. And there's a number of other questions along the way. So really try to dig in deep and understand why you are missing these things and know why you're getting them correct. Mark problems that you have trouble with in homework and yet somehow find the right answer. Was it a lucky guess, or was there some subtle cue somewhere in the problem that allowed you to just make a final decision at the last minute? Good review of all the homework you're doing is one of the essential factors for real success in improving your score. Thanks so much for sticking around for session 7. I'll see you guys for session 8.